The first lie I told Elena Cross's grandmother was that we had been dating for 8 months. The second lie was that I liked boats. Both lies were sitting across the dinner table from a woman who could apparently smell dishonesty the way other people smell rain coming, and she was staring at me over a plate of untouched trout like she already knew the truth and was simply waiting to see how long I'd dig. 8 months, Ines Cross repeated slowly. And you haven't taken him to meet the family until now, Elena? Under the table, Elena's hand found my knee and pressed down hard enough to bruise. A warning. Or maybe encouragement. With her it was always difficult to tell the difference. We've been busy, Elena said smoothly. Owen's work keeps him in the shop most weekends. Every eye at that long cedar table turned toward me, including the cousins, and his gaze had the particular weight of a man doing math he intended to use against you later. I smiled the way you smile at a job interview you didn't apply for. Someone has to build the shoes around here. Nobody laughed. My chest did the thing hearts do right before they fully commit to a bad decision. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had existed. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that at 26, I owned a narrow workshop on the edge of Harmon Lake with a hand-painted sign that said Hail Last, and a client list built almost entirely on word of mouth from people who wanted footwear that fit like it had been poured onto their feet instead of bought off a shelf. I spent my days measuring arches, stretching leather over wooden lasts, and pretending the ache in my shoulders from bending over a workbench was a personality trait instead of an occupational hazard. Elena Cross walked into that shop on a Tuesday during a thunderstorm so violent the windows rattled, wearing a soaked charcoal blazer and carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had run a design firm since her father died and never once let anyone see her drop the weight. I need shoes, she said, dripping onto my reclaimed oak floor. Good ones. By Friday. Nobody gets bespoke shoes in 3 days. I'll pay triple. It's not about money. Leather needs time. You can't rush a fit. She looked at me the way people look at a locked door they weren't expecting. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, short and disbelieving, like the sound had escaped before she could stop it. That's the first honest thing anyone's told me all week. I measured her feet anyway, mostly out of curiosity, and somewhere between the arch and the heel she started talking. Not about shoes. About a grandmother named Ines who still controlled 41% of the company through a family trust, about a cousin named Julian who had been circling the boardroom since his own branch of the business collapsed 2 years prior, and about a clause buried in that trust requiring the next controlling heir to demonstrate, in Ines's exact words, a settled and stable personal life before the transfer of voting shares would finalize. Settled meaning what? I asked. Meaning married, engaged, or in a long-term relationship her lawyers consider credible. Elena rubbed her temple. There's a family gathering at the lake house in 3 weeks. She's deciding then. If I show up alone again, Julian gets the shares by default. And if you show up with someone? She went quiet for a second too long. I don't have someone. That was the moment I should have kept my mouth shut and simply handed her a pair of shoes. Instead, watching her sit there trying to hold an entire company steady with nothing but posture and stubbornness, I heard myself say something reckless. I could go. Elena blinked at me like I'd suggested performing surgery on myself. You're my shoemaker. I'm also apparently available on weekends, according to you 2 minutes ago. This isn't a joke, Owen. I'm aware. I'm also aware that your grandmother controls 41% of a company and your only competition for it is a man who sounds like he irons his socks. I'm offering to be convincingly boring at a family dinner. That's a service I can provide. She studied me for a long moment, calculating something I couldn't read. You'd have to know things. My father's name. My mother's maiden name. The fact that Julian broke my collarbone sailing when I was 12 and has apologized exactly 0 times. Write it down. I learn fast. Why would you do this? I could have said something practical about client relationships, or joked my way out of the honest answer. Instead, I told her the truth, mostly because lying to her felt like it would ruin something I hadn't identified yet. Because you walked in here soaked through, refused to let anyone see you rattled, and still noticed when I told you something true instead of something convenient. People like that don't come through my door often. Color rose along her cheekbones. She looked away first, which I would later learn she almost never did. Fine, she said. But we need rules. The rules, delivered over lukewarm coffee at her kitchen island 2 nights later, were extensive. No touching beyond what looked natural. No flirting with her cousins to make Julian jealous, because apparently a previous fake suitor had tried that and it had ended with a slap drink and a lawsuit threat. No mentioning money. And absolutely no falling for each other, since, as she put it, that would complicate an already complicated arrangement. I agreed to all of it while privately suspecting Rule 4 was going to be a problem. We built our story like I built a shoe, one careful layer at a time. I learned her mother had died when she was 19, and that her father had built the firm from a garage and a stubborn refusal to fail. She learned that my own father had told me, more than once, that making shoes was a hobby dressed up as a career, and that I'd spent years quietly proving him wrong, one satisfied customer at a time. She learned I hummed off-key when I concentrated. I learned she chewed the end of her pen when she was hiding worry behind a calm face. By the second week, the pretending had started slipping into something that no longer felt rehearsed. She showed up at my shop on a Thursday evening carrying takeout and an old photograph of her father standing beside the first pair of shoes he'd ever had made, insisting I needed visual proof of what real craftsmanship looked like before I met the family. We ate noodles on my workbench, surrounded by half-finished lasts and curls of scrap leather, and she laughed at something I said with her whole face, unguarded in a way I suspected the boardroom never saw. You're better at this than I expected, she admitted, licking sauce from her thumb. At noodles? At being believable. I'm not performing right now. The words landed heavier than I intended. She went still, noodles forgotten, something uncertain crossing her expression before she covered it with a joke about my terrible taste in workshop music. I let her have the joke. But I noticed she didn't correct me. The lake house sat on 11 private acres, all cedar shingles and wraparound porches, the kind of place built by people who had never once worried about property taxes. Elena's family arrived from 3 states, filling the wide dining room with old grudges dressed up as small talk. Julian shook my hand with a grip designed to test something, his smile pleasant and entirely unconvincing. So you're the shoemaker, he said. Elena's never mentioned anyone quite so hands-on before. She has excellent taste in craftsmanship. We'll see how long it lasts. That was the undertone of the entire weekend, a low current of scrutiny running beneath every polite exchange. Ines watched us across every meal with the sharp, unblinking attention of a woman auditing a company's books. She asked questions designed to trip us, and more than once Elena's hand found mine under the table before I'd even realized I'd hesitated. By Saturday afternoon, something had shifted between the performance and the truth, and I could no longer clearly locate the border. We walked the dock after lunch, ostensibly to give the family a photograph-worthy moment, and Elena stopped at the end of it, staring out at water gone silver under an overcast sky. You're good at this, she said quietly. Almost too good. I told you. I learn fast. That's not what I mean. She turned to face me, arms wrapped around herself against the wind coming off the lake. You remembered my mother's favorite flower without me telling you twice. You held my chair before I even reached it. You looked at Julian like you actually wanted to protect something that belongs to me. I do want that. Because we agreed to make it convincing. Because it's true, I said, and the words came out steadier than I expected. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks this stopped being a job, Elena. I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was the noodles. Maybe it was the first time you laughed at something and forgot to check whether it was appropriate. She stared at me, the wind pulling strands of hair loose from the knot she'd pinned that morning. For a moment I thought I'd broken something between us, some careful architecture she'd built to keep her life from collapsing. Then she stepped closer and kissed me. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't for an audience, since the dock was empty and the house too far behind us for anyone to see. It was slow and searching, her hand curling into my collar like she needed something solid to hold on to. When she pulled back, her forehead stayed against mine. That wasn't part of the rules, she whispered. I'm willing to renegotiate the rules. Her laugh came out shaky. This is supposed to be fake, Owen. Tell that to my pulse. We might have stayed there indefinitely, wrapped in the particular quiet of a lie that had quietly become true, if Ines Cross hadn't chosen that exact moment to appear at the top of the dock with her cane and her unreadable expression, watching us with the patience of a woman who had clearly been standing there far longer than either of us realized. Elena, she called. A word. Alone. Elena's hand slipped from mine, worry flooding back into her features. She followed her grandmother up the path, and I stood on that dock feeling the cold for the first time all afternoon, certain our arrangement was about to unravel in front of the one person whose approval controlled everything. I found out what happened an hour later, sitting on the porch steps while the family drifted toward evening drinks inside. She knew, Elena said, sitting beside me, voice low. The whole time. She knew we weren't really together when we arrived. My stomach dropped. How? Apparently I've never once brought a man here who remembered to bring an umbrella for my aunt's dog, refill my water glass before I noticed it was empty, or stand between me and Julian without being asked. Elena shook her head slowly. She said real affection doesn't announce itself. It just quietly takes care of things. She said the fact that we started pretending and it stopped looking like pretending told her more than any engagement ring would have. I turned to face her fully. So we're exposed. We're not exposed. We're approved. Elena's mouth curved, something fragile and hopeful breaking through. She's transferring the shares. Not because we lied convincingly. Because somewhere in the middle of the lie, she watched it become real, and she said that was the only kind of stability she ever actually cared about. Relief hit me so hard I laughed, the sound cracking halfway through. So the lie worked because it stopped being one. Apparently. Elena studied me, some of her usual composure slipping away entirely. Owen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, not for an audience. Always. Was any of this real for you? Before today, before the doc? Or did I convince you into something you talked yourself into believing? I took her hand, turning it over so I could trace the calluses along her palm from years of drafting tables and stubborn independence. I've spent 3 weeks building an elaborate cover story around the plain fact that I liked you the moment you refused to leave my shop without proper shoes. Nothing about that part required convincing. Her eyes filled, and this time she didn't try to hide it behind a joke. I don't know how to do this without a plan, she admitted. I've never let anyone see the parts of my life that aren't managed and scheduled. Then let this be the one unmanaged thing, I said. I'm not asking for a trust clause. I'm asking for you. She kissed me again on that porch step, slower this time, without an audience to convince and without a single rule left standing between us. Julian left the lake house that evening without saying goodbye, and by the following month the transfer of shares was finalized, Elena stepping fully into control of the company her father built while somehow also, impossibly, keeping the quiet shoemaker who had once measured her feet in a thunderstorm. We were married the following autumn on that same dock, string lights strung between the cedar posts, her grandmother seated in the front row with a cane and an expression that finally looked satisfied rather than assessing. I wore shoes I'd made myself, broken in slowly over months the way anything worth keeping should be. Elena wore her mother's earrings and cried through half the vows, which she blamed entirely on the wind. When I slid the ring onto her finger, she leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "Best pair of shoes you ever made," she whispered, "were the ones that walked me straight into this." I've thought about that lake house often since, about how a lie built out of desperation turned into the truest thing either of us had ever agreed to. Sometimes the fit isn't obvious right away. Sometimes it takes patience, and pressure, and someone willing to stand still long enough to be measured properly before either of you understands what you're actually building. What would you have done if your boss showed up soaked through a storm and asked you to pretend to be the love of her life? Have you ever had a lie turn into the realest thing in your life? Drop your first name, your age, and the city or country you're watching from, and tell me your story in the comments below. And for those who'd like to be a little closer to us, we've opened memberships where you'll get shorter exclusive stories every week with no ads. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.